Right, so welcome this afternoon, everybody, to this afternoon's meeting. We're going to have a slight, you'll know from the notice, we're going to have a slightly different format today. So we're going to invite five speakers to speak for 5 to 10 minutes on their chosen topic. They'll do that one after the other, and then Roger will sum up at the end. So just to outline it, we've got Matthew who's going to be first on Gaza, followed by Finn on Syria, followed by Charles on artificial intelligence and BRICS, followed by Rolf on Greenland, followed by Joe on the Workers' Party, followed by Roger, who will sum up the overall perspective. So that's how we're going to do it this afternoon. So who did I read out first? I've just forgotten now. It was Matthew, wasn't it? Matthew, I think I said you first. Are you there?
You did.
To kick off, please.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Thank you, comrades. No, it'd be interesting. I think it'd be useful discussion. I think obviously the two important things that stick out are Gaza and Trump, but I don't think anybody else is going to talk about Gaza. I think that, it's extremely significant, really, is that the inhabitants of the world's largest and most horrible concentration camp, Gaza, have been basically attacked by imperialism. Effectively, okay, the actual agency was the Israelis, but everything that has been provided to the Israelis from the US and from the other imperialists, including Britain, have all been participants in this, and they have basically won against that force. They failed to crush the 2.3 million inhabitants of that concentration camp, Gaza. It's extraordinary. It's an anti-imperialist victory. Obviously, as Trotskyists, we can and should be critical of the politics of the people, whoever. You can go through the whole thing in terms of the Palestinian resistance and the forces involved. Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, PFLP, DFLP, even part of Fatah, the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade, and numerous other Palestinian factions. But that doesn't alter the fact that Gaza, despite, obviously under conditions of huge suffering, an immense infliction of enormous casualties. Estimated by the Lancet in July last year at 186,000, and therefore, far larger than that. And this is talking about people. That estimate was based on people who would die as a consequence. So you're probably looking at in excess of 250,000 people. But nevertheless, unfortunately, of course, our victories are won at great cost due to obviously the nature of material conditions, the fact that the imperialists have far more resource and so on and so forth, and are utterly barbaric. And this is what Gaza demonstrates, of course, is the barbarity of imperialism, that it is quite prepared to slaughter whoever stands in its way without even a hesitation or turning a hair. But nevertheless, they've failed, and that, I think, is a huge thing. It's as significant as the defeat of the US in Vietnam. That is the case. That obviously that has been prepared in the military terms, and you can go through the techniques and so on and so forth. It's been carefully prepared by the resistance over a period of at least 20 years. It's not a casual thing. The fact that they operated out of tunnels, the fact that they actually created their own weapons industry, that most of the weapons used were manufactured in Gaza, or repurposed. In fact, it's a combination between repurposing Israeli weaponry, which they captured or had dropped on them. If you reckon that something on the order of 100,000 tons of bombs were dropped on Gaza by the imperialists or by the Israelis, although the bombs were provided directly by the US. And the dud rate on those bombs is at least 8% and probably more. And therefore, Gaza is essentially coated with high explosives. to the the matter of probably in excess of 10,000 tons of unexploded explosives, and that some of that was repurposed for weapons manufacture, and just straight repurposed. They actually were using dud bombs and just wiring them up to extreme effect. The notion that the Israelis had that all they had to do was cut off the supply along the Philadelphia corridor, the border with Egypt or Rafah, and so on and so forth, and therefore that the resistance would not be able to resupply itself was just wrong. The resistance had taken account of that, and so in those terms, it's what the effect of that is, both in terms of that. It's a huge blow to the whole imperialist operation in the Middle East and elsewhere, Middle East in particular. It also, of course, the other thing is it demonstrates to the entire world the nature of imperialism, the fact that the imperialists are barbaric, the fact that the entire political class, from the likes of Starmer, Scholz, Sunak, whoever, Macron, whoever you name, had no compunction, nothing, didn't turn a hair at the slaughter of hundreds of thousands. That's normal business to them, and that's demonstrated in the eyes of the world. People can see that. That's extremely important. That what they're dealing with is monstrous people, and the obvious conclusion, of course, is that Gaza is not alone. That in fact, these people are quite prepared to do that to anybody, and that's what's on the agenda in terms of the preservation of imperialist power. That obviously the other thing, of course, is the direct attack on democratic rights. Which we can see everywhere. That you see, the attempts to repress anybody in solidarity with the Palestinians, and in fact, the very right to assemble, to demonstrate, to write or speak freely. All of these are clearly under attack, and all of this extends to anyone who is in opposition to the imperial power, and therefore, what you're seeing obviously is the ending of the sort of mask of capitalist democracy being stripped away, and in fact, the application of various forms of the iron fist. So, in those terms, an extremely important event. In historical terms, and in terms of the nature of capitalist rule, a turning point as well. So I'll leave it there. Thanks.
That's great. Thanks very much, Matthew. Kept well within your time there. Thanks a lot for that. Finn, can we move on to you now on Syria, please? Have you heard me okay? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, Kerma, just following on from Matthew's point, the chronic instability in the world today is exemplified most clearly in the Middle East. Obviously in Gaza, the West Bank, Lebanon, places of that nature, but it's particularly at this juncture significant that the instability in Syria is a direct consequence of the role of imperialism. There are two aspects to the instability. First of all, is the imperialistic intervention over the years, the imperial powers, initially France and Britain intervening in such a way as to create unstable states. Britain given responsibility for Mesopotamia, a part of which became Iraq. France given responsibility for Syria and what became Lebanon. France, from the very beginning, exploited religious, ethnic, and tribal divisions within the areas for which he was given a mandate by the League of Nations. They were Christians, there were Muslims, various forms, Druze, Shiite, some Sunni. And then France then hived off a part of what was then known as Greater Syria, hived off a part of it and called it Lebanon, where it had a Christian majority. And even within Syria itself, they divided up the area of Syria into regions under the control of religious minorities. So firstly, the imperial powers have the first responsibility for the divisions and the problems faced across the Middle East, in particular in Syria. More recently, of course, it's no longer France and Britain are the dominant imperial powers. The imperial power now that's dominant is the United States. The United States sets the agenda as though Israel was actually a state of the American Union. It's treated in that way. It's just an arm of the US in the region, which is useful from the point of view of arms production, security industries, and so on, but also as an outpost of imperialism in the Middle East. Syria, because of its current situation, illustrates most acutely what the problems are. The overthrow, as I've said in previous meetings, of Assad was a major victory for progressive forces, not just in Syria, but in the region. And the defeat of Assad also was followed by a significant weakening of the role of Iran in the area and also of Russia in the area. These weakenings of Iran and Russia are significant factors in considering perspectives and events as they continue to unfold in Syria and in the Middle East in general. At the present time, there are various forces fighting for influence within Syria. The principal force is, of course, Turkey. Turkey is the country that is most at stake in the Syrian developments. There are 3 million Syrians currently have emigrated to Turkey, which creates its own problems for Erdogan in Turkey. Turkey has intervened significantly in the north of Syria over a long period of time. Firstly, they want to fight against Kurdish militias because of the opposition they have to the creation of a Kurdish state. So that conflict in the north of Syria. America, for its own purposes, supported and still support Turkish militias in the north of Syria. America has intervened, or the US has intervened significantly across Syria. So you've got Turkey and the United States intervening directly, trying to influence events in Syria. Turkey has a lot of influence over the HTS. That's a group that is supported in the north of Syria. In part of Idlib, the Idlib province, HTS, which is the current leaders of the new, if you can use that expression, Syria, were supported by Turkey. And when they advanced on Damascus, which is what happened in practice, the Syrian army just melted away, disappeared. Soldiers abandoning weapons, even abandoning their uniforms. The regime wasn't able to sustain itself. The regime now, the spokespeople of whom the HTS were, their origins were in the jihadist movement, al-Nusra, particularly in northern Syria. But now the leader of the HTS group, which was victorious, is claiming that they're moving away from jihadism, moving away from Sharia law and towards an inclusive society. They won't be making that choice. These choices, unfortunately, at the present time, are being dominated, and the choices are being regulated by Turkey and the United States, but also Israel. Israel is pursuing its agenda in Syria. They have invaded parts of southern Lebanon. They've extended their control in the Golan Heights. They blew apart much of the Syrian army's weaponry, tanks, and every aircraft, everything they could find. So Israel has made a significant intervention in trying to weaken Syria. And I know it's a shortish introduction, but I want to just comment on the groups. In my opinion, speaking from a military point of view, Hezbollah, Hamas, and the Houthis have in reality been defeated militarily. They've survived, and they claim that survival is their victory. The fact that they're still there is a victory, but we can't look at things just from that point of view. The question is the liberation of Palestine any closer now than it was? Have the actions of Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthis brought Palestinian unity any closer? Have they facilitated the development of a progressive or leftward development, not just in Palestine itself, but across the regions which would be influenced, such as Jordan, Syria? And of course, the answer to all of these questions is no, they haven't. And the original aim was to exert or to inflict a military defeat on Israel. That has failed. Hamas began as an arm of the Muslim Brotherhood in Palestine. The Muslim Brotherhood was a right-wing, feudal, aristocratic movement which began, well, aristocratic probably isn't the correct word, but a restoration of landlord rule. It began in Egypt in 1927 under a guy, Banna, and then it extended its influence into a number of countries, never making a significant intervention, but it attempted. But Hamas became their branch in Palestine. That's no longer the case, of course. Hamas is no longer an arm of the Brotherhood. Originally, Hamas had the aim of defeating Israel militarily. You remember the bombs that went off in Tel Aviv, the bus bombings, the killings, people being killed by virtue of being Jews. That was the policy. No, they've changed that policy in some years ago to a new charter, as they call it, without actually abandoning the earlier charter. And then when they were in control in Gaza, that should have been a significant advance. But of course, the main problem there was America. America encouraged Hamas to get involved in politics. When they did, they then refused to talk to them, to deal with them, to trade with them, to have anything to do with the Hamas government. Again, you can see the problems that America has caused. There was then a civil war basically in Lebanon, in Gaza, between Hamas and the Palestinian Authority. The Palestinian Authority made major concessions to imperialist forces in the Oslo agreements. They basically agreed that in return for a token parliamentary presence, they would then become Israel's security presence in the West Bank, which is what the Palestinian Authority in reality became. They were promised to have elections and a statehood within a 5 years of the Oslo agreements. Not only did that happen, it didn't even come close to happening. It was never the aim of the Israeli government to allow a Palestinian state.
Ben, can I just nudge you? You've had 8 minutes.
Oh, yeah. Oh, sorry. Okay. And just getting back to Syria again. There used to be a strongish left movement in Syria and Lebanon. The Communist Party in Syria was significant. There were also organizations of the labor movement. Unfortunately, under the leadership of HTS, this new group, that's not going to be developed. Ultimately, the only answer to all of these problems, whether it is Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, Egypt, or whatever countries, the only solution is a socialist solution, bringing together progressive, socialist, left-wing, trade union, and community forces in a pan-Arab basis. This was attempted before under Nasser, but after following the officers' movement in 1956 or in the 1950s. Later with the Ba'ath Party in Syria and Iraq, none of them succeeded. There was even an attempt in World War I under the Hashemites to get them to seize power, to become the power brokers in the region, and all the countries would follow the Hashemite dynasty. So all the attempts have all failed, and the only solution is to look towards a left-wing, progressive, socialist movement, which would also involve Israel. Unfortunately, in Israel, the Histadrut, which was the mass trade union movement, was incorporated into the land seizure policies of Zionism. The Histadrut, which was meant to be a union, didn't allow membership to Arabs. Not just that, the dark-skinned Jewish people who lived in the Arab countries, in other words, the Arab Jews, the Jewish Arabs, however you describe them, were also discriminated against within the Histadrut. So there's terrible problems facing the organised working class, but still, there is no alternative. There's no other way out of it. And it's not sufficient. I've been on all these marches, marching around shouting about Palestine will be free and all the rest of it, everybody chanting, but without thinking, how is this going to be accomplished? And it reminds me a bit of the marches I used to go to on the Vietnam issue. People were marching around the street shouting, ho, ho, Ho Chi Minh, in. That was the chant. So, and the same kind of attitude is being developed now that I must say, I don't agree with Matthew's characterization of Hamas as the resistance. They have resisted, and they're conducting resistance. That's not in doubt, of course, but the resistance, I'm comparing them to, say, the National Liberation Front in Vietnam, I think is probably stretching the point a bit. But I conclude with on that point, the only way to solve the problem, and needs to be spelled out, people need to face up to it, is by a socialist federation of Middle Eastern states. Egypt, Lebanon, Syria, Israel, all the countries of the Middle East coming together in a socialist federation. There is no shortcut. There's no military way out. There's no military victory. Israel will not be defeated militarily. That's not an option. The only way to change the situation is to unite workers, communities, trade unions, activists, progressive forces across all of these countries. Thanks.
Okay, Thanks very much, Finn. Yeah, obviously, if we can keep these introductions between 5 and 10 minutes, we can return to the discussion later on, and we can develop any points that have been raised, because obviously there are many, many of those. So we'll move on now to Charles, who you're going to talk about artificial intelligence and BRICS. Is that correct? You need to unmute yourself because I've got everybody muted at the moment. Hi, Charles.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So that's a
Yeah,
bit of a
so between
stretch. I
5 and 10 minutes.
I'll
Yeah.
try. I'm going to have to throw away my notes and just kind of go off the cuff because my 30 points will take 30 minutes. But and artificial intelligence will come up, but it's really kind of in passing as a comment on what's going on. So we look at it. I'm speaking on the thoughts of the International Leninist Trotskyist Tendency, Communist Workers Group, and the way we see the development and changes in the world of inter-imperialist struggle between the declining U.S. hegemon and the rising China-Russia bloc, with the BRICS in tow as a struggle of the BRICS to and dependent nations to find a way out from under the U.S. And Western domination. They've been drawn into the BRICS, into the China or Russia circle. I could really develop the discussion about the rise of the restoration of capitalism in China and that debate with the other tendencies, but that would take a lot of time and discussion. In short, we see the restoration of China in 92 with the dominance of the law of value being put in place at the 14th Congress as a crowning event over the Deng Xiaoping reforms and the crushing of the working class at the Tiananmen Square events that opened up the road for China. And then we saw that as a slow road of restoration in relationship to the fast-paced restoration of Russia, but in relationship to the development of capitalism in the West, it was fast and jumped over many of the steps, and of course not hindered by the illusions of Western democracy. It was able to march forward with its capitalism with a powerful executive of the Chinese Communist Party, using the mechanisms of the legacy of the deformed worker state to mobilize state monopoly capital, invest in SOEs and private capital, and start to accumulate on a grand scale. We identified in 2004 through more in around 2008-9 the development or the emergence of Chinese imperialism, not so much in the military sense, but in terms of its need to invest abroad, and of course at that time it was very small, and the overwhelming outward foreign direct investment was much smaller than the incoming foreign direct investment, but the trajectory was clear, and what we've seen in the interim I think confirms our prognosis at the time. Not to pat ourselves on the back, but we're just trying to understand the world so that we can change it, and in that process, they joined the GATT and the WTO in 2001, and the monopoly of foreign trade was basically destroyed, and the accumulation of U.S. treasuries was one way that they could hold onto their capital, and then they started to have to invest abroad. The U.S., of course, sent Hank Paulson over to help them develop capitalism. I guess I'm getting caught in the debate with those who don't believe that China was restored. I don't want to get stuck there in this short introduction. But what's happened in the interim, 2008, I think we discussed the other day, is a major demonstration of the world crisis of developed capitalism. It was China that was able to hold the world afloat based on its development and concentration, development of the working class and production there. But it never really pulled. And we agree with Michael Roberts on the long depression concept. I mean, maybe it's a series of long recessions, but Western capitalism never really pulled out of the 2008 debacle. And I mean, we see it here at least, and you see it there in the living conditions, working conditions of the working class in the West. It's never reemerged above there. We never made up for the loss and the drop down in our wage base and our buying capacity. So to kind of jump, and I know time is flying in this discussion, we have these rising powers challenging for the ability to invest abroad, and we look at the growth of Chinese GDP, of foreign direct investment, and what we see is they're challenging all across the world for the West. The West might still have more FDI stock in the global South, but in direct investment ongoing and trade, it's moving up towards China, and the GDP in the West is struggling, while the GDP in China is up, and in all the BRICS countries is outpacing the West in the last year. So we see inter-imperialist conflict in all of the particular events: Ukraine, Syria, the DRC over the rare minerals, in the struggles that are unfolding in Latin America for control of the resources there. And so the U.S. ruling class has basically said, okay, we wish we could do what China is able to do, and they've conceded to the authoritarianism of a Trump who's pulling a new McKinley and saying, okay, we're going to take our sights off of China. We've been trying to surround and contain China and Russia for years. That has not worked. And so we're going to take our sights off of China just a little bit to consolidate where we're starting to lose. And our sights are now on the Americas, on Panama just yesterday, not to ignore what we just saw in the DRC with the conflict between the M23 and the Kinshasa government and the South Africans, and we'll kind of try to get a little bit to the BRICS have put their peacekeeping troops in there and lost some troops. So there's a struggle there and upset in South Africa with the placement of troops over there. How does this go to the issue of you said AI? I'm going to kind of drag that in a little bit. There's a big piece of the chips war going on, and the thought was that the West was going to be the powerhouse in the chips war with the ASML over there in where are you in Netherlands, making the factories that make the chips, and the development of the chips in Taiwan, and the West and the U.S. is seeing, oh my gosh, this is all happening over there. We have to bring it home. So you have the Biden Chips Act, and we're going to stop China from getting the chips and contain them. And what do we see them do with all their tens of thousands of software engineers and bright people being pushed through the universities there, and the state capital able to shift and concentrate to make
Charles,
them.
you've had 8 minutes.
I'm gonna try to wrap it up.
Sorry.
You saw them with the Huawei phone, able to outpace by doing a method of stacking of the chips and compete with the Western phones, and that was a coup de grace against the West. And now, just in the last few weeks, we've got the Deep Seek, which I tried, and it's pretty marvelous. And what did they do? They made it so you don't have to have I don't remember the number, but it was almost like, from 10 chips down to 3 chips, and of course orders of magnitude to actually accomplish what they were doing. So this massive AI investment of all these big tech companies, they've just been caught in a classic situation of the anarchy of production, overproduction, being caught up by innovation and technology. So we have an unfolding crisis, and it can really only be resolved in wars, and those wars are currency wars, wars of tariffs, and they unfold as military wars, and they've been unfolding on the backs of the workers across the region, across Ukraine, the war against Gaza, the war against the people of Africa, and now we're going to turn that into a war against Panama. So you know, all this in the face of a metabolic rift. Bellamy Foster explained to us how Marx showed that capitalism would come up against its limits. Gosh knows if the limits of capitalism are going to unfold before the planet unfolds. So the task falls to us as Marxists to see this, and as militants and revolutionaries to build a revolutionary opposition and the cadre forces necessary to defeat the compradors. And just to wrap it up in terms of how we see the BRICS, you know, the Chinese have been selling it as a win-win options for the compradors of the global South to sign up with them, to take their foreign direct investment as an option against taking their relationship with China, with the West. But in reality, what that's going to do is what we saw in Namibia when we were united to defend the Rossing miners, is China stepping in, making its profit and taking it home. The local compradors trying to grab their bit, but it's not the liberation of BRICS is not the liberation of the masses, only the socialist revolution. And then we see that as a confirmation of the theory of permanent revolution and the tasks that we have.
Smashing. Thanks very much, Charles. Again, we'll be able to continue that discussion once everybody's done their introductions and ask more questions and develop things. So next on the list, I've got Rolf, who is going to follow on with that by talking about America's latest plans, which is the acquisition of Greenland. Do you want to go ahead, Rolf? 5 to 10 minutes.
Thank you very much. Well, I will say a little about Greenland. As you said, Trump has demanded to take over Greenland in making America greater again, as you know. Well, I don't know very much about Greenland, because the Greenlander more or less have been living by themselves in Greenland, and we haven't heard much from Greenland in Denmark before now, when Trump has gone out to demand to overtake Greenland, and he has also said that he will use military or economical means to take Greenland. Ironically, well, if he make an invasion, the first troop, the invasion force will meet, that will be American soldiers, because in Greenland, the U.S., since the World War II, U.S. have had bases, military bases in Greenland. The biggest one in the northern part of Greenland, Thule, but also other military bases. And if they wish, they could make new ones, because treaty made between Denmark and U.S. in 1951, they have access to all Greenland if they wish. Well, in the underground, Greenland has some important minerals, but they are very difficult to extract, and American firms has not before been interested in extracting them. So the question is why Trump insists on demanding to take over Greenland. Greenland has been a Danish colony for 300 years. It's the biggest island in the world, but only 56,000 people live in Greenland. Most of them live in the capital, and the rest is living in small coastal towns. And Greenland, during the years they got more and more autonomy, and now they have a governmental government, or what is called self-government anyway, taking care of the domestic things in Greenland. But if it is foreign affairs, it's still Denmark. What we have seen in Greenland is also increasing demand for independence of Denmark. They have a problem because half of their state budget is paid by Denmark, so it will be very difficult for them to become independent. Probably it's many things that this demand of independence is why Trump has reacted, because the government they have in Greenland consists of two parties. The biggest political party declare itself as socialist, and it is in a coalition with the Social Democracy of Greenland. So it's quite left government in Greenland. We know that it is known also in the US, because in right-wing circles in US, they call Greenland Arctic Cuba. And of course, what they fear is that if Greenland become independent, there will be a fear of Greenland be influenced by China or Russia. We're going to have an election in 2 months in Greenland, and we already now see that Trump and company is trying to influence the election. What will happen? Well, it's difficult to say, but of course, US demanding Greenland from Denmark, of course, has created a very big crisis in Denmark, and we have seen the Prime Minister trying to get support to avoid that Trump take over Greenland, and she has had meetings with the Nordic countries, with the EU, and so on, trying to get support. And what we also see, the Danish state, they have suddenly put a lot of money to defend Greenland, to avoid Trump taking over Greenland. And of course, Greenland is part of the Arctic area where increasing tension between the big powers. We see the increasing tension. So of course, this taking over Greenland is part of US to have control of what is going to happen in the Arctic area. But it's difficult to say what they would do, but it's of course part of an imperialist way to well, the US is not better than Putin and Xi Jinping.
Okay.
They are all of them are making their countries greater again. Okay, that was what I would say about Greenland and Trump.
That's great. Thanks very much, Rolf. So finally, we move on to Joe, who is going to talk about workers' parties. Joe, are you there?
I am here. Hold on a second. What I had planned to talk about and what I'm going to talk about now, two separate things, but I will touch on workers' parties and their the role they can play and so on. Okay. Apologies for this. I'm caught a bit on the hop here. I'd like to really talk about, zone in on something that we don't really focus in on too much, which is social democracy. We treat it as a bad concept, and in a way, it is a bad concept. It's a flawed concept. If you come at it from a Marxist approach, in that social democracy, where it came from, was originally a very progressive force, and then where it ended up as a very, very negative force in society, which gave birth or resuscitated the right wing in society, resuscitated the far right, and so on. I'm going to start with social democracy when it started back in the late 19th century, early 20th century. And if you look at the social democratic parties, and we take the Russian one, as everybody knows, I'm not going to speak at length about any of these. I'm just going to just breeze through them, because everybody who's in attendance there knows an awful lot more about these things than I do. But from what I know, the Social Democratic Party in Russia moved to quite radical position, particularly in 1917. It housed the development of the Mensheviks and the Bolshevik Party. There were debates in relation to socialism, the future of society, the whole lot. Socialism initially wasn't on the agenda, we know that. But then from February onwards in 1917, the party transformed from being what we would call probably a left reformist type party into a revolutionary party, following the split, and obviously the Bolsheviks led that. So within the emergence of the Social Democratic Labour Party in Russia, it was a very positive thing. It gave voice and expression to millions of people who looked for change. There were other parties there, of course, but I'm not going to go into the whole history of the Russian Revolution now. But the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party was a social democratic party which enabled the masses of people to have a vision of an alternative society, one without Tsarism. And yes, they envisaged that there would be probably Russia joining in sort of the European-wide movement of democracy, and joining up with the Western countries and so on. But it evolved into something completely different, and then provided us with the reference point of October 17. You could also look at the Social Democratic Party in Germany, which also had a Marxist, considerable Marxist presence. It had those that weren't Marxist at the same time, they could still be described as left reformist. There were social democratic parties in Austria, other countries as well, and every single one of them stood for significant changes in the system. Then as we moved through the 20th century, the social democratic parties moved to a position of more softer left reformism, and then from having spent a period of time in roughly, broadly speaking, in that category, they then moved into a position of practically supporting the concept of neoliberalism, not overtly, but in all but name. And as I said earlier on, by their total sellout, they gave birth to the right wing, the resurrection of right wing ideas and right wing parties like the Front National in France, and the proof of that is, as it is in Italy and Spain and all countries, that in the areas where the Communist Party and the Socialist parties were strongest, particularly the Communist Party in the industrial heartlands of France, in those deindustrializing areas, the voters that formerly, the families that formerly voted Communist, all were switching almost en masse to the Front National. So it's the failure of social democracy which has led to the growth, essentially in support for right-wing parties, as people in despair reach for something which they feel will put a radical stop to the hemorrhaging of their of all the things that they held dear in the 60s and 70s, and they associate losing those things with things like immigration, the role of the state, and so on. And it's just social democracy played that treacherous role for a few decades, and in that, giving rise to the right wing, it's led to a situation where we are now totally on the back foot in relation to the right wing in society. There's also in response to the decline of those parties, I'm just speaking from the head here now, okay? I've abandoned my notes. But in response to the decline of those parties, other parties have emerged, not just right-wing parties, but parties that have, in essence, have memberships which are totally disillusioned in the roles of the socialist parties and communist parties and so on. And in France, they formed an alliance called France Insoumise. In Spain, you've got people in Podemos, and Germany, Die Linke, and so on. But a lot of those parties were built on the basis of or following large social movements in those countries. So they didn't emerge from nowhere. And the reason I'm highlighting that is because, say, and I think we need to, I mean, I really want to focus on Britain, and it's not me, I'd like the British comrades to focus on Britain, that in the absence of large-scale social movements, people are trying to really establish a new left-wing mass workers' party. And when we say a left-wing mass workers' party, we essentially mean a left-wing social democratic party. Because if we're talking about creating a mass revolutionary workers' party, then we're not really in the real world. Every single self-styled, set-up revolutionary party in isolation from movements of the class that is set up, they are all in crisis. They're all isolated, full of sectarians, have gone nowhere. They've spent 40 to 60 years talking about the need to build revolutionary parties. It hasn't happened. We're not going to be able to do it either. So when we're talking about in England, the creation of a new alternative workers' party, mass workers' party, and we can't control that obviously ourselves with a tiny handful of people, but we need to be looking to where do we see that coming from? I don't have to have an answer to that question. None of us do. The future is the future. We can see signs of revolt in a few different areas, but will it all be tied together? Can it come together? And again, I hold up France. There's a bit of hope there, because you've got France Insoumise is now actually a party. It's like a large alliance, but it's also in essence an alternative party to the Socialist Party. And by the way, it has grown as well in the context of the growth of the far right in France. They've obviously got a very significant presence. Again, I don't need to point out figures there. Everybody in the room here, everybody attending this meeting knows about that. But we've also seen a rise in the support for the Socialist Party, which is, you know, a very, very soft alternative, probably a very middle class support as well. But nevertheless, there's a rise again in support for social democracy, if we include France Insoumise as an expression of social democracy in terms of their platform or their program for government, if they got elected, would largely be left reformist. They would focus on reforms in the area of housing, wages, pensions, and so on. And the question is that we need to be looking at what we are at as individual comrades. What are we really supporting the development of? How do we see building? What is the role of a Marxist in 2025, taking into account all that's happened in the history of social democracy, looking what's happened to the mass workers' parties, how they've been replaced, where some of them are staging a comeback. I haven't got time to go into individual countries in relation to Germany. And
Well, you've had about 8 minutes now.
okay, I'll finish up in the next minute. But we need to be asking ourselves, what do we see? What is our perspective? As Finn points out, we need perspectives. What is our perspective for the growth of a workers' party? How do we see it being built? Particularly, as I said, when the new ones that have emerged on the back of movements. And the final point I'll make is that I don't see this as being a slow development. I think in a period of extreme turmoil, which we are now entering, Roger's referred to the perfect storm in the past. I don't need to kind of break that down. Everybody knows what I'm talking about in terms of climate, the economy, and so on, and society. All the storms that are breaking out, fusing together. But so the development of a mass workers' party, if it's set about properly in a non-sectarian way, and if it can be driven from below, can burst onto the scene very, very quickly and emerge. As I said, like if you look at France Insoumise, it didn't exist 10 years ago. So, and I'm not saying it's the answer to all our ills either. Don't think I'm holding it up as the model socialist party or anything like that, but the fact that it's there is significant, because in the absence of a large party like that, then it's a free run for the Front National and so on, or National Rally as they're called now. So I'll just leave those considerations for people in a nutshell. Social democracy is, you can look at it in various ways, a necessary evil, an inevitable growth, or whatever. But our role is really, when you look at the far right and you look at the vast majority of workers, what they look for their needs to be met in the program of social democratic parties. And our role is, I think, to help rebuild mass workers' parties, and then to fly the flag for Marxist politics within those parties. So I'll just leave it at that.
That's great. Thanks very much, Joe. Right, so that's the last of the five introductions. So the meeting's now thrown up for contributions. I will prioritise anybody that hasn't spoken already. So if you want to speak, stick your hand up and I'll sort of take you in some sort of order. So it's lots and lots and lots of issues been thrown up there. Tamos.
Well, I think it's a fantastic tour of the situation, and I think the whole thing, I feel it's succeeding. It's succeeding in various ways. First, in focusing on each specific situation and not being general, but at the same time, by focusing on that, I would get the feeling that everything is pointing to one basic thing that we should center, what we should be focusing on. That's there is no solution on a country-to-country basis. We are talking about a world movement that is whatever happens in one country, it affects everything else. I shall go through what has been said, I hope very quickly, but I don't know if anyway, you can stop me when if I am getting out of time. First of all, about Gaza. It's true that the nature of imperialism is demonstrated to the whole world. This is, on the one hand, something that makes people react positively and try to resist this. But on the other hand, it creates an atmosphere in which barbarity is being normalized. And the road to war becomes much, much easier. So we should be very careful that whatever we say about the survival and therefore the win of the Palestinians, something that is not at all one-sided. It could work the wrong way around. The same thing I can see in Finn's talk about the area and Assad. We have never been fans of Assad, but at the same time, we cannot possibly see the deposed Assad as something, as a victory for the people of Syria, because what we have here is a much worse situation, much more unstable, and something that is really something is not anything better than what happened in Libya. I would also agree that the crisis that the world faces today, then the conflict between the US and China, Russia, etc., it can only be resolved on the basis of wars, and that's the more fearful thing we have lived through, at least in our lives. I mean, we haven't seen anything like this before. It's only comparable to the pre-World War II situation. And in this sense, we are moving fast. I mean, 5 years ago, nobody would talk about the World War. Today, it's on the agenda if we are not into it already. And how do we face it? I think that the left in various countries had its chance and it failed. And once it fails, it opens up the road to the extreme right, and we can see this today. Not in every country. France has not been such a case. Spain, I'm not sure, because Podemos was going somewhere at the time of Syriza's rise, but after Syriza's fall, Podemos it just survives. Probably there is a hope as well. Britain, still, I thought there was a chance with Corbyn. We failed there as well. And also, this brings me to the questions. I hear many times criticism of Corbyn or Bernie Sanders, that they are not in favor of building a workers' party, and nothing can be done by being part of the left wing of the establishment. I think we are living in a situation where these people are the sort of people that can bring life and can bring allies to the working class. Very short term, but we are living in a short term situation everywhere nowadays. These clashes today, that the social democracy is losing, Bernie Sanders is losing, Corbyn is losing, is the sort of battles that people are prepared to fight. And it's through this that a situation can arise when parties can be built and can be transformed into revolutionary parties. Francis Sumis is one situation. I don't trust Mélenchon, but what he's fighting for is worth fighting with him. And I would agree that social democracy is probably a necessary evil, and we should not turn our backs to the united front politics. In the sense of today's realities, it's not enough to get the conditions that Trotsky was putting forward for this situation. Trotsky had the right idea at the right time. They failed to take root. We should see this united front policy today in today's condition, in today's merits, because I am convinced, as much as anybody can be convinced these days, that we are moving towards the destruction of huge proportions, and it's in this. We should try to avoid that, and if we don't avoid that, we should be ready to confront it and face it, and try to keep our forces and our analysis sane, so that a resistance can be built.
Okay. Thanks, Temos. Matthew.
Yeah, comment. Yeah, thanks for that. I think there's really, first of all, it's to understand the nature of the shift to finance capital, which has allowed essentially the capitalists to smash up the organizations, the base organizations, the working class in the workplace. I mean, finance capital is mobile, it's strategic. It effectively looks at factories and so on and so forth and said, well, if we're not making enough out of you, we'll shut you down. If you say anything we don't like, we'll shut you down. and therefore, essentially what's happened, of course, is the actual guts of the organised working classes have been ripped out in many of the imperialist countries, particularly obviously the US and Britain as the one the hegemon and the second the oldest capitalist country. And so therefore, you can see that in political tendency. The second, I think, is the importance of Trump. Trump, of course, means that the finance capital and so on, and the Silicon Valley mob are actually wanting to confront the working class head on. I mean, they're taking essentially their program from Milei in Argentina. So frontal assault on the working class, all of its gains, all of its social structures, services, wage levels, benefits, etc., they actually want to take all that apart. Obviously, on the basis of the desperation of the US, both in terms of the crisis of capitalism itself and the particular crisis within that of the US's hegemon, which obviously is, we can see that the structures it put together and the basis of its dominance of the world is falling apart. So that element together makes up the impulse for Trump's program, which of course, no part of the US ruling class, I mean, whether that's the Democrats or whatever else, are actually prepared to oppose. They all basically will go along with that, because obviously they see their interest at the same time in that whole program. Hence, what we're seeing in those terms. Now, in world terms, of course, this will make huge difference, because obviously the pressure will be on. The US's hegemon is attempting to extract more from the rest of the world, attempting to use its position in order to pull out more surplus value from the rest of the world, to hold itself up. And in those terms, I mean, actually, of course, what it's doing is destroying the structures that it put together itself. I mean, the structures that allowed the US to run the world post World War II are definitely being destroyed, because obviously it doesn't have the room to have those anymore. The likes of the UN and so on and so forth, all these things, and in terms of the collaboration between the different imperialist powers, all of that's going to change. And the question is, okay, what is the dictatorship, the move to dictatorships of both the US itself dictating to the rest of the world, and of course dictatorship, the ending of bits of the main large structure of capitalist democracy itself. That putting that amount of attacking the working class to that degree, of course, requires dictatorship. They can't afford democracy anymore. And therefore, that's going to be used. That's going to happen. It's going to happen in the US, and it's going to happen in other capitalist countries. And therefore, in terms of, we can see that assault on democratic rights, and in terms of the structure of bourgeois democracy being unravelled or just crushed. So, in those terms, I mean, it's an extraordinary time, and things are going to change really quickly. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Matthew. Dominic?
Yeah, it's not on any of the points that the comrades have spoken on so far. I was trying to put something together on the economy, and I couldn't. But I just wanted to make I've made a few notes about the impact, the potential impact of Trump's tariffs. So far, he's announced tariffs on China, Mexico, and Canada. And when you go back to the basics as far as the US and its strength is concerned, I mean, it accounts for about 26% of the world's economy, with a population of about 4% of the world. So it's the major power, as everybody knows. But just looking at what the annual imports into the US were, and they're about 3,370 billion. Of that, China, Canada, and Mexico make up 1.38 billion, 1,380 billion, I should say. That's about 40%, if my maths are working out right, of the total imports into America. And Trump is talking of 10% on China, 25% on Mexico, 25% on Canada. And that comes to a total of, what is it? 2,700 billion, which if you look at that as how it affects, if everything stays level, how that would affect the American population, it's an average of $800 a year per head. And that, you can imagine, is not going to be faced by the billionaires and the rich. That burden will be passed on to the working class. And part of Trump's strategy is to raise $1 billion in tax so as he can give it to the rich. And we've seen that with his attempt to stop government grants. He put a block on them for 3 months. He had to pull back because part of his plan was to allow it to individuals. Of course, it's not allowed to. The individuals get it through people who are given grants. The government doesn't have anybody queuing up one at a time. So I think you can see in that Trump, with his tariffs, is planning to raise a hell of a lot of money out of the working class. But the thing to me about it is that none of this seems to be planned. There's no strategy behind it all. It's just, we're going to do this. And like with the grants, when it fell foul, they withdrew it. Whether they're going to do the same on the tariffs is dependent on what happens as far as Mexico, China, and the rest of the world is concerned. And as far as Canada's starting to do, they're starting to say we're going to introduce tariffs on the United States, which could really affect their auto industry and Mexico, because part of the problem is you're not talking about Mexican firms and Spanish firms and Chinese firms. Mixed in with that, there's a heck of a lot of American firms. And why you've got the Rust Belt is because they shifted manufacture out of the States for cheap labor in China and Mexico, and presumably technical side of things in Canada. So that's I just thought that's something to look on, but it's a broader thing we need to look on, is what Trump's economics are. Because at the end of all the discussions, I always think that capitalism is not about imperialism. It's not about anything else. It's about what Mr. Ford said. He said, we're not in business to make cars, we're in business to make money. And the economy is the spur that keeps them going and doing all the other things that they do. So I'll leave it on that. I'd like to come back later on, if I can, just a few comments on what other comrades said.
Okay, thanks, Dominic. Who's next? John.
Hello, yeah. I'd just like to come in on what Joe was saying about the need, to build a mass workers' party.
Social democracy.
The role of social democracy. The fact is, in my opinion, and it goes largely unsaid, that the working class have received two massive setbacks from the left over the last 5 to 10 years, or particularly over the last 5 years. In Britain, the role that Jeremy Corbyn played, I think, has been absolutely diabolical. Jeremy Corbyn set in train a real serious movement of workers and, particularly professional workers, to go into the Labour Party, to change the Labour Party. And Jeremy Corbyn, instead of heading that movement, he went along with the national executive, with the full-time officials, and continued their programme of expulsions, etc. He's been mute on the fact that the Labour Party was anti-Semitic. Well, I've been in the Labour Party for whatever it is, 60 years. And quite frankly, I've never come across any anti-Semitism, and I've never come across any racism in the Labour Party, or not what I would call racism, any road. And the fact is that he stood meekly by and allowed himself to be bloody crucified by people who've no interest in the working class and no interest in socialism. The fact is that he should have really grabbed the bull by the horns, but rather than that, he was more interested in the Labour Party remaining something that the right wing wanted it to be, i.e. a right-wing social democratic party that was totally embedded with capitalism. The other person who I think has done an absolute disservice to the working class and to the Labour movement is Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders was faced with the fact that there was a serious movement in America that combined students and workers, because Bernie Sanders talked in terms that workers could understand, i.e. that they were being ripped off, the workers, and firms like not Primark, what do they call it? Walmart, were receiving government bloody aid. And, you know, I listened to Sanders when he was speaking, when the, you know, if you like, the last election took place where, you know, Trump was, you know, successful. But as I say, both Sanders and Corbyn were more interested in keeping their relative, we'll call them for whatever it's worth, their relative social democratic parties in power and remaining with the status quo. So there have been opportunities over the last period for the working class to, if you like, become a real force in society and become a real force in terms of, you know, changing society. I mean, to come back to Corbyn, he allowed them to slag him off over the results of the 2019 election, whereas he should have said, look, the real results when I was in charge, or were perceived to be in charge, was the 2017 election, one of the best victories for the left in Britain and one of the best results for Labour in Britain. I mean, it was pointed out that one town that had resisted just about every move to the left since the war, i.e. that was Canterbury. Canterbury didn't turn Labour in 1945 when there was a huge landslide for Labour. It never turned Labour when Wilson got a landslide. But it turned Labour when Corbyn stood. And there were many places like that. And quite frankly, I think myself, in analysing the situation, we've got to seriously look at what happened there. That if you like, Corbyn's acolytes were momentum. A momentum like Mélenchon in France was a private company. It wasn't a movement or a strand within the Labour Party. So I'll leave it at that, comrades.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, John. Anybody else? Do any of the speakers want to come back in and add any remarks that they maybe didn't get in first time round?
Dominic. Who? Which one?
Dominic.
Oh, just Thomas has still got his hand up. I thought that was.
Oh, right. So you didn't mean to put your hand up, right?
Did, yeah.
Yeah, go on then. And then it's after that, it's Rolf. Yeah, go on.
There's a couple of things. It's just a couple of points. I think on Matthew's thing, I think Finn took it up as well. Is this question of what's victory? I mean, you can say they had a victory against the foot soldiers, but they didn't have a victory against the aircraft in in Gaza. The Israelis won the battle, whatever else you say. The fact that, you know, you've got the state in Gaza that you've got now, it's highly debatable whether Gaza can ever be rebuilt under the present capitalist system. And the Trump plans for expelling Palestinians into Egypt and Jordan and anywhere else he can get them to go. I've not heard any major sort of thoughts on that from the surrounding Arab governments. There's been no mass sort of outcry or anything else like that. So you can say basically that they're consenting to it.
No, that they're opposing it.
They might be opposing it in words, but what are they doing about it? They're not raising a clamour. They're not breaking off relations with Egypt or anything with Israel and anything like that. They've still got those things in place. So I think it's right to say that, you know, the ground forces of the Israeli army were received a big setback, given this, and the biggest setback I think they received is this title they had of the highest moral army in the world. I think that one is blown out of the water. So I'll leave that one. But I just want to come back to Joel's about social democracy. I think we've got to understand the nature of social democracy. Social democracy is socialism that rejects Marxism. That's the whole thrust of it. And whatever else we say about mass parties, we've got a mass, well, I don't know if it's a mass party now, but we've got a mass social democratic party in Britain. And that's a Labour Party. It's still there. Is somebody going to take on its shadow? Is somebody going to mimic that? I mean, I remember Ted Grant used to say, the thing about social democracy is it comes in with reforms and goes into government with reforms and goes out with counter reforms. Well, Starmer skipped the first bit and just did the counter reforms to start his government off. That's social democracy. And however you want to dress it up, basically, the one thing they won't have is Marxism.
Okay, thanks, Dominic. Temos.
Just a short comment on the question of Bernie Sanders and Corbyn. Their importance is not because they are or they are not revolutionaries, but they are or are not believing in what we believe that the working class can do and deserves. Their importance is that they are fighting for issues that the working class understands, and they are finding they are finding people who listen to them and are prepared to fight with them. And we should not expect that we can build a mass party just outside the movement. That's the important thing. It has to be built on the basis of social movements, as Joe said before. I mean, Francis Suisse was built on the basis of social movements, real social movements. Syriza was built on the basis of a real movement, and there Syriza messed up because they went right through to revolutionary situation, and they pulled back. Now, if the left in Syriza had a more solid program, they could prevent that. They didn't. Their program was just a program to get out of the euro and back to the drachma and try to fix the situation with normal capitalist economic measures. So, and this is how situations develop. Society revolts. Some new forces come into play, and in that storm of the revolution that is taking place, we should learn to swim with it. We should learn to win people at that time. We should have a perspective of winning people and building our forces when things start to move. Otherwise, we shall just be outside the whole movement and fail to link up with the masses. And it's important to link up with the masses of the Labour Party, with the masses of social democracy. In France, I wouldn't go to the Socialist Party anymore because it's gone. I probably wouldn't go to Syriza in Greece because it's gone. But we should see where the masses still believe, and that's where we should be. We should be with them. They are doing the fighting. We are just part of it, and we should both learn and teach in this situation. It's not something that we can say we know what must be done, and we tell the people, we convince them, and they come with us, and we make a revolution. That has been a failed project for more than half a century, for almost a century now.
Okay, thanks, Thomas. I'm going to just ask Mike to speak next because he's not said anything yet, and then we've then got Matthew and Joe, and then we might have to ask Roger to sum up. Then would you like to go next, Mike?
Can you hear me?
Yep.
That's good. All right. Now, this discussion has reminded me of something of Michael Roberts' blog that I read a few months ago about China and America. And he basically said that the USA had two choices. Either they could militarily defeat China, or they could introduce a similar kind of economic system to what China has in order to catch up with their production. And that, of course, as we know, means slavery. And what you can see Trump doing now is heading in the direction of ending democratic capitalism and heading towards slavery, enslaving workforce. And the imperialism is more through economics than it is through war, although that will probably come. But what's the answer? In the early 1930s, the 20s and 30s, the left in Italy and Germany was actually very strong, and yet they were absolutely trounced once Hitler got to power. And we're not in that position that the left was in at that time. So what chance have we? And as far as social democracy goes, yes, you have to be where the working class is. But, what do you do as Marxists in a party that doesn't believe in socialism and doesn't believe any longer in social democracy? I mean, you only have to look at how the poor and pensioners and all are treated in Britain now under the Labour government. I can remember last winter, the Tories actually threw money at poor people in order for them to be able to heat their houses and eat because of the cost of living crisis. And what has Labour done? It's taken all of that away. It thinks it doesn't need to care about poor people. It's even taken away, cold weather payments for pensioners and all sorts of things. That is a move towards the same kind of thing that Trump's doing, only in a different way, and maybe not as blatant. But some of the stuff they have done is very blatant. Scapegoating pensioners and Muslims and all the rest of it, and unemployed people and sick people. That's what we're moving towards. We're moving towards a world of slavery, and we don't seem to have any answer to how to fight it.
Okay, thanks, Mike. Matthew.
Yeah, a couple of points. I mean, the thing is, you have to understand in terms of Gaza as a victory. I mean, yes, the Israelis have the advantage of their air force at this point, although I don't think that's eternal. But the question really is, of course, that you know, in these terms, if you want to win military victories, it's done by troops on the ground. The objective of the Israelis was to destroy Hamas, or effectively the resistance, which is not just Hamas, but other forces as well. And they failed, completely failed. Instead, of course, they actually been driven out. They attempted to occupy Gaza and they were driven out. The IDF has lost thousands of armored vehicles. Its own, you know, in terms of its damage to its own soldiery. It's also, of course, was suffering as a, you know, levels of desertion because people refused to go back. The reservists said, well, we're not going to report back because we've had enough. We've done this enough and we've, you know, been shot at. Israel isn't actually set up to fight long wars. You know, this is the first time Israel has fought a war over more than a few weeks. You know, because it's just not able to do it. I mean, it's really caused an enormous amount of damage. It's a huge, and the thing is also, of course, it's also the first time the Palestinians have won. You know, the actual Palestinian, you know, a Palestinian organization on the ground has won against the IDF in 70 some odd years. It's extraordinary. It really is extraordinary. You know, and you have to look at it like that. You know, in those terms, and the effect it will have in both in the Middle East and in world terms. Now, the other thing, of course, is to look at people talking about reformists. Now, the problem with reformists, of course, is they'll only do what the ruling class will allow them to do. It's perfectly obvious. You should look at Corbyn and say, you know, it's quite clear the ruling class is just saying, well, no, you're not getting any of that. None of it. Same for Sanders. You know, he says, well, okay, we can have these reforms, and the ruling class says, you're not getting any of it. We actually want more from the working class. We want to squeeze the working class. We're not giving them anything. Not the time of day. What do you expect? You know, seriously. I mean, you know, so Syria's collapse, you know, was within the matter of a few weeks in terms of, you know, go around Europe get its face kicked in, saying, you know, please, can you give us this and give us that? No, you're not getting any of it. You know, get on with it. You know, give us the smash the society up, give us what we want. Corbyn, of course, if he'd got into office, which is very unlikely, there's no chance the right-wing Labour Party were going to allow him to occupy number 10 Downing Street, none whatsoever, because obviously there's no way they would allow him to occupy that office. It contains too much power, but he would have collapsed within minutes. There's no question of that. And the thing is, obviously, I mean, the function of Sanders, of course, is to maintain the Democratic Party, the chief instrument of American imperialism over decades. You know, what do you expect? It's also, of course, to understand Stalinism, the nature of Stalinism. You know, the fact that the collapse of the German workers' movement in 1933 is down to the Stalinists. You know. I mean, this is why Trotsky founds the Fourth International, is the fact that the Stalinists collapsed politically in the conditions, as he pointed out continuously. The working class had the advantage, could have crushed the fascists, you know, but instead actually facilitated them taking power. And there was no reaction within the Comintern to that. That's why he founded the Fourth International, is exactly the point, you know. And in those terms, you have to understand, obviously, that the reformism isn't going to produce anything other than defeat and demoralization. What else could it do? The question is, okay, how does the revolutionary left actually build something of real, you know, within the working class? You know, what model does it use now in terms of building an organization within the working class which is capable of taking on the ruling class? And the problem is also, I mean, we look at the you know, you can look at the whole structures and the trade unions and so on and so forth. The problem is the bloody unions don't want to take on, you know, are inadequate now, quite clearly. You know, the union bureaucracy basically is in the pocket of the ruling class. How do we deal with that? These are the questions. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Matthew. Joe, can we go back to you?
Yeah, I'm maybe I was taken up wrong. I'm not campaigning for social democracy and the elimination of Marxism from social democracy. I'm actually arguing for the opposite. I'm arguing for our participation in it's not because we want them, it's because they're emerging, and it's because that's the way the masses go. The masses, the vehicle they choose is a mass party arising from movements on the basis of the last 10, 15 years, whether it's Syriza, France Insoumise, Podemos or whatever. These movements arise. We can't, because we know betrayal is inherent in the leadership of those organizations, because we know that the leaders will be too meek and mild, they will balk a transformation. That doesn't mean we then avoid them or we don't engage. We have to be part of them. And this is why the revolutionary left get nowhere, because the revolutionary left do not really, for the most part, put in the time doing the spade work in their unions, being active in terms of taking on roles within their unions, taking on officerships, taking on the roles of building a group around them, building the left within the unions, and then going from there to try and get that reflected politically. It's a very long, hard job doing that over 10, 15, 20 years. That's how you get your respect. You don't get your respect shouting, oh, we know you're wrong, you're too meek, you're too mild, we knew you'd sell out. And I'm not saying, John, that you're advocating that. I know you probably were an union activist all your life. I'm just saying right now that on the basis of what I'm seeing around Europe, but I think Britain is an outlier on this. That's why I asked a specific question in relation to what way do the comrades in Britain see it going. But really, we have to be involved in those social democratic parties for the same reason that Lenin criticized those in left-wing communism and infantile disorder, because you have to engage with these with the masses who are in those parties. And it's not always the masses, but certainly there are numbers in the tens and the hundreds of thousands in some countries. I agree. Jeremy Corbyn was far too meek and mild. Bernie Sanders, just not taking on the role of splitting and forming a party, a new party, a new socialist party. It's so obvious to us. It's absolutely obvious to us. But apart from them not having the guts or the balls or whatever you want to call it to go and do that, I would rather, in terms of engaging with people in the outside world, not focus all my criticism on those two, limited as though they are, but on those that fail to support them around them. The John McDonnells, the Momentum, all the people around. When you see what they allowed to happen to Jeremy Corbyn, he was the guinea pig for this anti-Semitism plot where they conflate the definition of anti-Semitism with Israel, criticism of Israel. That's what that was all about. He was the guinea pig. They succeeded, and the left quotation marks, allow that to happen to him. He is a mild-mannered gentleman of the left. He always was that kind of individual. But that's precisely the kind of individual that history throws up into a leadership position. But he didn't have, he read the room, and he reckoned he didn't have the support to take on the establishment and go the road we would love him to have taken. I would criticize him for that, but he read the room correctly when you look at how the others did not back him up, did not put up any fight for him. And to me, I'm listening to, a lot of the people in the Democratic Socialist Party of America. They're lacking in guts as well. They're lacking in any real conviction in terms of what they're about, what they want to do. They don't really have any perspectives. They have no real, roots in the American labor movement. So they're not going to be forming any new party. But anyway, instead of me continuing on for another 8 minutes, I'll ask the question again, comrades. The British Labour Party is a total disaster. It's paving the way for Nigel Farage. That's what they're doing. They're getting the ground ready for him in terms of like the net effect of their politics, attacking pensioners, attacking working class, doing nothing other than undermining every single tradition that the Labour Party once stood for. They're making the words Labour Party dirt on the mouths of the people and the communities that formally support them. So in the absence of something happening there, what people recommend or what's being done, and do they see any other person on the horizon or group on the horizon who can pull together a left-wing serious left-wing united front or some sort of a presence that when movements do take place, they can then get involved in those movements, and maybe there might be a fusion into a political force arising from that. So I'll leave it at that.
Okay, thanks, Joe. So we've got Charles and then Finn, and then I'm going to ask Roger to come in and sum up. So do you want to go ahead, Charles?
Yes, I don't want to pick up on the 30 or so minutes that I have left from my notes because of the direction that the discussion went, and I don't see a whole lot of opposition to our arguments that China is restored capitalist and emergent imperialist, and the development of the inter-imperialist struggle, although there may be some people who disagree. But coming from the perspective of the United States, we don't really see the Democratic Party as a social democratic party or an equivalent of what the Labor Party was at the point that it really had political independence. In our tendency, we kind of saw the demise of the Labor Party. Well, I mean, its social democratic role for decades and decades, all the way back, to Henderson and Lenin's critique. At the same time, the real, I guess, acid test and turn during the Blair years made it so that there's really not much room for work in there. And we had that analysis across the social democratic left of Europe. But then when we saw Syriza break from the social democratic majority, I remember the name of the party in Greece, we had a struggle in our small sectarian tendency of a handful of militants who were operating, and said it ultimately led to a split because we saw the need to orient towards the emergent Syriza, because that's where the masses were reaching in an attempt to rebuild working class political independence. Of course, I agree that had to be a short-lived participation, because immediately they turned, and in our one little leaflet that we put out on our international blog, we warned exactly the direction that it would go, and we think that groups like the Woods IMT group stayed in there way too long for making that orientation and trying to redirect the direction of the movement. In terms of the United States, where we are, I agree with your comments on many of the comments of the comrades on the direction of Trump and the rise of authoritarianism. We see the attacks on the immigrants, the Black community, and the need for fighting inside of our unions to build a united front for self-defense of the working class. And in there, of course, we come up against a totally statified union leadership that defends capitalism, imperialism integrated into the Democratic Party, which, again, I emphasize is a capitalist party. And that's why our tendency and a few others on the left oppose support for Sanders, while some actually kowtowed and went towards him. And that was the explosive growth of the DSA from a handful of long-term social democratic layer to 90,000 folks. But that was wasted as there was no revolutionary wing in there to fight for class independence and to explain the role of the capitalist Democrats as the imperialist war party, which we've seen over the last few years. So I agree with the comments of the Labor Party opening the road for Farage in the same way that Obama opened the path to Trump the first, and Biden opened the path to Trump the second. This is what we see over and over when our work is done. So the question is, is there really a role for the Revolutionary Workers Party developing? They're all going to come and join our tendency because I write the perfect leaflet and hand it out to 10,000 people in a blog. Of course, we have to intervene in the mass movement and in any formations that are there. And we argue and fight for a united front for a mass workers' party and for a fighting workers' party. And we fight the way that Trotsky answered Shachtman in the discussions around the transitional program. And Shachtman opposed entering the Labor Party moving for a Labor Party, saying, "Oh, but it's going to be a reformist party." And Trotsky said, "Yes, but we're going to bring our program into it. We're going to fight for our program." And that still, to me, appears to be the task today. So I'll close it off on that.
Thanks for that, Charles. Finn? You muted, Finn. You'll have to unmute yourself.
Yeah, I have brief comrades. Interesting points made by Matthew and Dominic there about the Middle East. There hasn't been much discussion on that, but the issue I want to raise merits a discussion on its own. It's not this issue about what's a win, what's a victory, what's a defeat. It's not an abstract question. Our task is not, we're not influencing people in Hamas. We're not influencing people in Gaza. So when we're talking, we're trying to convince sources about an approach or convince workers about what approach we should take. And the matter of defeat or not isn't a technical matter. It's a matter about politics. And if you compare, for example, are we any closer to Palestinian statehood or independence or freedom now than we were, say, a year and a half ago? The answer clearly is no, we're further away than ever from a Palestinian state. And we're not here to just pay tribute to brave fighters. People will always resist. No matter what happens, people will always resist oppression. Any place in the world where there's oppression, there's going to be people fighting against it. That's always going to be there. And the bravery of people who fight oppression is extraordinary, particularly in a place like Gaza. But we're not a psychological society. We're really trying to find an answer. And if the demand is not being realized, and if the movement that's necessary to build in order to achieve that demand cannot be built by a group such as Hamas or Hezbollah, then that's the main question, really. We need to bear in mind that there was an intifada in 1987 to 1993, which involved masses of people in the West Bank, masses of people, young people and communities. And Israel, and it achieved certain objectives, but again, Israel could manipulate the situation to their advantage there. But nonetheless, it was a mass movement. And Israel then intervened to build and to support Hamas, along with Qatar. They worked together on this, on the funding of Hamas, in order to split the movement which was emerging from the Intifada. They supported Hamas because that would break them away from the PLO and Fatah. So that's where Hamas, and this began, that's where it started, with the support of the Muslim Brotherhood. So we need to know what the origins are. We also need to remind ourselves that the International Criminal Court, which found Netanyahu and Gantz guilty of war crimes, also found Sinwar and Hanya to be guilty of war crimes. Now, the Israeli state eliminated by execution Sinwar and Hanya, but nonetheless, the International Criminal Court, if we cite in relation to Netanyahu, also found Sinwar and Hanya also guilty of war crimes. And again, it's not a moral issue. We just need to realize who we're dealing with here. And the main question, which I began with, is really to see, was it a success in terms of Palestinian advances, or was it not? That's the question. And just one last point. Israel was always, from the beginning, from 1948 onwards, always looking for an excuse to drive Palestinians out of what they consider to be Greater Israel. It's always been there, looking for an excuse. And even without an excuse, they conducted wars in 56, in 73. And it's worth mentioning, by the way, there has been no support militarily from any Arab state for the Palestinians since 1973. So there's nothing to be gained by looking to the Gulf monarchies, or for that matter to Egypt or any other state either. But Israel was always looking for an excuse to invade and to wipe out the Palestinian population. That's part of the strategy of Netanyahu and his government, and that continues to be the strategy. That has not been in any way driven backwards. In fact, they're more intent now on pursuing that strategy of emptying the West Bank of Palestinians, of supplanting the population of Gaza with Israeli settlers. That continues to be their policy. And the war or the military campaign of Hamas hasn't diminished in any way. That in fact, if nothing else, the October the 6th was the excuse that Israel needed to carry out a massive slaughter, humanitarian slaughter and barbarism, war crimes, genocide. They used October the 6th as an excuse. And Israel wanted an excuse, and now they've got it. So when we're looking at victory and defeat, it's not about the bravery of individuals. It's not about the technicality of how many troops were killed on the ground versus the Air Force. I mean, it's not about technicalities. It's about, are we closer to the objective, or can we build a movement around Hamas which will achieve that objective? And I think the answer to both questions is no. We're further away than ever, and any movement that's based around tribal, ethnic, religious, or other divisions across the Middle East only worsens the problem. And this axis of resistance, which Iran supported, Hezbollah, the Houthis, and Hamas, that so-called axis of resistance hasn't achieved its objective in any way. And that's the way to approach it, not the individual bravery or the amount of casualties inflicted. No. Anyway, it merits a discussion of its own. I'm not saying these remarks conclude the discussion. They're only a stimulus to further discussion. That's all I intend these remarks to be. And we'll have to discuss it further. But we can't be just swept along with the mood of the moment either. And if we're going to influence people on the left, progressive and socialist people generally, we need to be clear on our objectives and how we're going to set about achieving these objectives.
Okay, thanks, Finn. Right, so we'll go over to Roger now to sum up. I'm assuming, Roger, you'll also, at the end of your summing up, will say something about next week's meeting without me needing to prompt you, if that's okay.
Yes, sorry, 1 second. Okay, comrades. It's been, I think, a very successful experiment today. I think it's very good that that we've been able to have a relaxed discussion, which is not confined to one topic, but a general overview of the world situation. I think it makes a relief, if you like, from the usual law. I think maybe we should do this every now and again, because I think it shows the enormous amount of creative thought and ideas that come from comrades in different situations, in different countries, and with their own unique experience in the labour movement. Now, I'm not going to try and obviously cover all the topics. I just want to focus on 1 or 2 points. First of all, what are the features of the current situation internationally? Obviously, the first point and the starting point is that capitalism is decaying. Its dominant former strongholds in USA and Western Europe and Japan have long ago lost much of any positive or productive mission. Capitalism is staggering from periodic slumps and crises to stagnation, punctuated by occasional brief, weak recoveries. But increasingly, the ruling class are indulging in parasitic, corrupt and speculative profiteering, creating a tiny elite of super billionaires, some of them almost on the brink of becoming trillionaires. Its political profile has degenerated accordingly into sleaze, demagoguery and war. And under its stewardship, the environment is rotting, posing an existential threat to human civilization itself. And at the same time, the supremacy of these old dominant powers is being challenged by the BRIC bloc, most of whom are satellites revolving around the rising new giant superpower, China, which I would characterize, it's a completely unprecedented kind of phenomenon, a kind of hybrid society, which due to the large element of state planning and control, has surged ahead economically and is now pioneering futuristic technical leaps forward in electric cars, in information technology. Of course, the latest example being DeepSeek, which I understand has thrown into panic the USA's only remaining productive activity. Now, no empire retreats gracefully once its time has come. The USA is preparing in the medium term, not in the immediate term, for a war with China, with the need first to weaken the power of China's potential ally Russia with its huge nuclear arsenal. And I think the main split between the two factions in the American ruling class is between one that is seeking to weaken and exhaust Russia by economic and military means, and the other is thinking to appease it and pacify it and neutralize it. But they're both means to an end, and the end is a confrontation with the main enemy, which is China. So we come now to the question of Trump. I was always going to call him the elephant in the room because he's hardly been discussed in this discussion. I think maybe rhinoceros might be a better description. But I think Trump is a manifestation of the political decay of capitalism. If you remember, Trotsky said that at one time British imperialism used to plan ahead for decades and even for centuries. With Trump, we can see it's completely eclectic from one moment to the next, not even one day to the next, a completely, just a completely chaotic programmatic agenda. So look at some of the things he's done in the first week or so of the presidency. Declared a trade war on Canada and Mexico. Promised to send 30,000 migrants to Guantanamo. He's threatened wholesale sackings of the federal employees. Literally millions of federal employees have been offered redundancy pay, 8 months' pay. That's all to vacate their positions. And then, of course, we have the threats now. Never mind of massive unemployment, which will come. We also have, as comrades have referred to, inflation caused by these tariffs, and also threat of tariffs even on US companies operating abroad, which would mean, if it worked, that that if these companies return production to the domestic arena, it would mean imposing similar third world conditions on US workers. So we can see, there's a huge explosion is building up for the future, and that means on top of all that we have the lunacy. Trump has threatened to go to war with Denmark. He's threatened the annexation of Canada. He's the most hilarious thing. He's stopped the shipment of condoms to a place called Gaza, which he thinks are maybe being used by Hamas to make bombs. And it turns out it's a family planning program to a completely different place called Gaza, somewhere in southern Africa. I mean, a completely inept leadership. And so all of this is part of a desperate and panic-stricken attempt to maintain US economic dominance. And the phenomenon of DeepSeek, which I might have to admit I understand very little about it, but it does highlight Chinese supremacy or superiority. And in the West and in the USA, the veneer of liberalism has just been torn asunder. We see it's not unconnected with the rise of neo-fascist parties, which are beginning to gain support in most of the countries of Europe and in the USA. Whether we can quibble about whether we call it fascism, of course it's not classic fascism, but what we call, for want of any other description, the far right, which is gaining support because of the really redundancy of the program of the liberals over the last few decades, and in default of any kind of leadership of the left. And it's a shock to class relations, and already we see there's just universal instability and unrest. Now, the working class is now absolutely forced to fight. There's never in history have we seen so widespread mass turmoil, mass instability, and a mass revolt worldwide. The youth, especially, are rightly desperate to fight for their future. They're searching for a political voice. And across the globe, we see uprisings, and we see the flight of autocrats fleeing for their lives into exile in country after country. And this left surge worldwide a decade ago has only been fallen into failure by the collapse of any kind of leadership. Corbyn, by the way, won more votes in 2019 than any other since 2001. Never mind in 2017, he won more votes, substantially more than Starmer won in 2024. But without a clear political leadership with a perspective, they just undergo a cycle. This movement of revolt, of partial and temporary victories, followed by brutal defeats, which again are not very stable and which lead to new displays of resistance and a period of complete instability and unease and instability of every kind. Talking about the social democracy, by the way, let's remember the social democracy was founded on Marxism. The victory or the foundation of the Second International was celebrated by Engels as the culmination of the work of Marx and Engels, because unlike the First International, which in the end split and was temporarily disbanded, if you like, the Second International was founded on at least explicitly or nominally, a Marxist program. But of course, it rotted in the conditions of capitalist growth of the period. But half a century ago, the trade union and the political power of the working class represented a formidable force, for instance, in the USA and in Britain. And now its industrial base is negligible and it's lost its political voice. I would say there are no mass workers' parties in the West now, unless we take perhaps La France Insoumise in France. But all the rest, either they've shriveled to nothing or they've been boarded by class enemies, and most of them both, one after the other. And I would say that the social democracy, or the last, it's in final spasms, you could say, in France, in Germany, in Scandinavia, and in Britain too, because I think Starmer represents one last fling, very, very weak and very unremarkable fling, which I think will be the final end of the Labour Party. But a new working class, too unschooled in the traditions of the first half of the 20th century, is coming to the fore. In the West, due to the loss of an industrial proletariat with its traditions of struggle, and in China, it's a new productive working class, and in the East and in the South, if you like, but all of them without the accumulated experience and traditions of the working class in the first half of the 20th century, up to the time of the Second World War. The working class today, though, are a majority of the world population. They include the women for the first time as equals, and in some cases at the forefront of the struggle. On every continent, the working class now has a presence, which was not the case in previous epochs. So in the place, we now have a new working class, elements who were previously either relatively privileged or medial in the West, but now discovering the power of solidarity and rising to their feet. But you see, we're getting in the West and so on, we're now seeing that actually the proletariat is as strong and as numerous as it ever was, despite the collapse of industry, because of the proletarianization of previously nominally middle-class sectors of society. But strikes of teachers or doctors or delivery drivers or office cleaners don't have the instant impact of industrial workers who can instantly stop the wheels of production. But nevertheless, a working class is developing and growing and learning the lessons of struggle. And meanwhile, in the East, a giant is awakening, which can still, I would say, decisively shift the balance. And that's why I think a decisive new chapter in world history is opening up now. Those are just a few very disjointed and very incomplete points. I think we'll obviously return to all these questions in future meetings on the individual topics that are being covered, but also now and again a general discussion of the overall situation like this. Thanks, comrades. That's it. And by the way, next week we'll have a great privilege of having Michael Roberts speaking to us again. This time on the whole worldwide situation and the trade war that's opening up, the impact of deep seek, and also the particular crisis which is developing in Britain. So thanks, comrades.
Okay, thanks very much for that, Roger. So that's the end of this week's discussion. I'd like to thank everybody for their attendance. Hope to see you all next week.
Okay, thanks, comrades.